Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight on this Wednesday, March 14th. The top three Democratic candidates for governor in their final meeting before Tuesday's primary. Hear what they think sets them apart and why they deserve your vote. That's next on Chicago Tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Ponce. With less than a week until the primary election, the Democratic race for governor is a juggernaut of activity. Endorsements and contributions are still rolling in, and candidates are no doubt thinking about both how they'd take on a Republican opponent in November and what they'll do next if they don't make the cut on Tuesday. But Tuesday is still days away, and the campaign is far from over. Joining us for their final candidate forum in the order they appear on the ballot are J.B. Pritzker. He's a businessman and venture capitalist who helped create the tech incubator 1871. Chris Kennedy, former president of the Merchandise Mart and former chair of the University of Illinois Board of Trustees. And Daniel Biss, state senator from Evanston and former University of Chicago math professor. We're joined this evening by members of the City Club of Chicago and their guests. Our thanks to the City Club for helping to underwrite this forum, and welcome to our viewers on Facebook and on TV and radio stations across Illinois. And you can join the conversation tonight via Twitter using the hashtag #ChicagoTonight at WTTW. Our Amanda Vinicky and Paris Schutz will be live tweeting during tonight's program. You can also share your comments on the Chicago Tonight Facebook live stream. Now please join me in welcoming J.B. Pritzker, Chris Kennedy, and Daniel Biss. J.B. Pritzker, this morning the Tribune published a detailed story about the trusts and companies you either hold or are connected with overseas. Is the main benefit of holding money overseas to lower your U.S. tax bill?
Well, remember, there's nothing new in that story in the Chicago Tribune. I've said all along that there were trusts created generations ago. I don't receive any distributions from those trusts, and all of the distributions go to charity. And on my statement of economic interest, all of the assets that are owned by the trusts and by me individually, as well as our charitable foundation, are listed. That's how the Chicago Tribune was able to report on it.
You make a distinction between trusts and companies because the Tribune reports that at least 11 offshore companies with ties to you or your family members have been set up in the past 10 years. And previously, you said that your offshore holdings were set up by your grandfather decades ago. Was that a lie?
No, in fact, I have no control over those trusts. The entities that are created, just like all trusts, they make investments, and so they were created by the people who control those trusts. And yes, remember, those trusts are focused on charitable giving, and so any distributions that are made go entirely to charity.
There are two categories of holdings overseas connected with you according to the Tribune. The trusts, which you may be alluding to now, and the companies, because the Tribune says at least 11 companies connected with you or family members have been set up within the past 10 years. Is that right?
Not set up by me, no, not at all.
Not set up by you. Do you have any connection with them in terms of financial interests? Do you have financial interests connected with those 11 companies, at least 11 companies, the Tribune says have been set up in the past 10 years?
No, those trusts are dedicated to charitable, and the companies underlying, I guess the trustees and the trusts created those companies in order to make investments. That's what trusts do, and so, whatever distributions get made go to charity.
So you're saying that there's no connection between the companies that the Tribune alluded to and the trusts?
Well, in my statement of economic interest, every underlying asset is listed. And so as they, say in the Tribune, in fact, those assets you can look at the statement of economic interest and you can see what we're looking for, remember, in those statements is conflicts of interest. And so when you list every single asset, it's known to the public if you have any conflicts. And I would make sure that there will be no conflicts when I become governor.
Daniel Biss, you're shaking your head. How come?
Well, we just heard this unbelievable mess of word salad that said nothing in an effort to distract us from what we learned by reading the Tribune this morning, which is that J.B. Pritzker set up companies offshore, probably to avoid taxes, and spent the entire last year lying about it. Come on, guys.
That's just not true.
Donald Trump is the president. Do we want this as the Democratic nominee for governor? 11 months ago today, I released my tax returns. I asked these two guys to do the same. They said they would. They were lying. Now we know part of what J.B. Pritzker's been hiding. I'm scared to know what the rest is, but we better find out before we go to vote on Tuesday.
Chris Kennedy, your reaction to J.B. Pritzker's statements?
I mean, this is what I'd say. I think this forum is part of the election process in the state of Illinois. And that election process is sort of like a job interview. We're interviewing for a job to be the next governor of the state of Illinois, to work for the people of Illinois, to work for the voters of Illinois. I've hired a lot of people, and I can tell you just one piece of advice to the voters of the state. You should never hire someone who lies to you during a job interview. If they'll lie to you to get the job, they'll lie to you to keep the job, and you do not want a liar as the governor of the state of Illinois trying to keep that job.
J.B. Pritzker,
So
are you lying?
Yeah, may I respond to that? Thank you.
Please do.
Let me say this, that, you know, both of my opponents are on the attack. We're in the last 5 days of a campaign. It's clear they're behind, and this is how they intend to run the rest of the campaign. In fact, they've been running it this way all along, quite negatively. The truth is that I'm trying to run a campaign about issues, and for the entire campaign, all the way up until January, we were all about issues in this campaign. And then, who went on the attack? Bruce Rauner and Daniel Biss and Chris Kennedy. They went up on the air first. And I think it's important to note that for people, that these attacks are an avoidance of their own records. They need to answer for their records, their voting records, and their record of either failed accomplishment or just utter outright failure.
Let's stay with the Tribune report just a bit longer, because you talk about the importance of disclosure so that one can assess whether or not one has conflicts of interest. One of the offshore companies that the Tribune reports you're connected to is Moreau Capital Holding, which wants to buy city land to offer duck boat tours. And according to a city filing, you own all the stock in that company. Is that correct?
No. The entity, by the way, that's looking to do business in the city of Chicago is, in fact, listed on that statement of economic interest. It's
What
called
is that entity?
Entertainment
Is it Moreau or
Cruises.
another shell
No,
company?
it's called Entertainment Cruises. There are no shell companies here. Entertainment Cruises is the name of the company. It's the company that operates boats on Navy Pier and does other, seaworthy ventures. That's the entity, and it's listed right there on the statement of economic interest.
You know, I just want to make sure I understand you, and I don't mean to overstate the case, but what you're saying is that these 11 companies are what? Not a recent creation, that is to say in the past 10 years, that they're connected with the trust, and therefore they're part of something that was already established, and therefore what you said about all your holdings having been established years ago, that's what makes it truthful?
Phil, those entities were not created by me. They were created by trusts that I do not control, trusts that are entirely dedicated to charitable giving.
All right, let's, Chris Kennedy.
Let's return to that notion about who's going negative. And the truth is, J.B. Pritzker is spending millions of dollars, $500,000, maybe $250,000, $500,000 a day going after either Senator Biss or me. And the truth is, when you can't win by telling the truth about yourself in a competition, sometimes you have to try to tell lies about your competitors in order to win, and that's exactly what he's doing.
These two went on the attack on television and on radio.
Excuse me. Let's just look for a quick second what's happening here, because I think it's really important that we just articulate this. We are in this unique moment in America with massive income inequality, a failed billionaire president, a failed billionaire governor, and we're trying to decide what kind of model of politics the Democratic Party should believe in. And you have here two options of two guys who want to just spend millions of dollars and try to buy an election. And look, JB spent $63 million so far, and it's not working. And I get that that must be extremely upsetting. You can't get out of the 30s spending $63 million of your own money. And so you're trying to pummel everybody else. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But what I'm offering is a different vision of politics. A middle-class progressive is going to organize people to win next Tuesday, and then organize people to get excited to turn out and vote and beat Bruce Rauner.
You've campaigned as a middle-class candidate, looking out after the interests of the middle class, and have been critical of your opponents for their wealth. Can somebody be wealthy and be a good Democrat?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm critical of my opponents for trying to buy the election. I'm critical of a vision of democracy that says, whoa, Bruce Rauner's got so much money, so the only thing we could do as Democrats to succeed is to find an even wealthier person to spend even more money. I think that is taking our party down a dangerous, dangerous path. We should have elections, not auctions.
Last point on the Tribune article. Chris Kennedy, you were also named in the Tribune investigation as having money offshore. Are other taxpayers picking up part of your tab?
Absolutely not. The Tribune identified a company that sounds like one of JB's tax avoidance companies that I have an investment in. But the company that I have an investment in that has a similar name files in the United States every year, files with the IRS. I pay both federal income tax and state income tax. What he's done is he's avoided paying taxes in the United States. That means that all of us, it's not that the cost of government went down. Every taxpayer in the United States now pays more in income tax because he paid less. Every filer in Illinois pays more income tax in the state of Illinois because he paid less. Just like all of us who pay property taxes in Cook County pay more because he paid less through this property tax cheat. And that's his model for making money.
But the
J.B. Pritzker, excuse me,
is that we don't
J.B. Pritzker, go ahead.
Attacked by
Daniel
Chris
Biss, I'll get back to you in a second. J.B., go ahead.
First of all, again, in the Statement of Economic Interest, all the assets are being reported. And I put out the information over the last 3 years that federal and state taxes paid by trust for my benefit and personally $150 million. So there's no tax avoidance here. All of the assets that are going to charity are going to charity. All the assets that are not charitable are paying and they're paying right here in the state of Illinois the highest rate that you can pay, a corporate income tax.
So the only tax avoidance involved, then, what you're saying has to do with charitable trusts, in which all the proceeds are going to charity.
You're calling that tax avoidance. I mean, charity is charity.
And yet, even a charitable foundation, even charities, if a charity is taking an income, normally would be subject to taxes, would it not? No?
No. If you give to a charity.
Let me just quickly, though, if I could, Phil. I appreciate, Chris, that you're saying that JB has been involved in tax avoidance. I have my own suspicions, too, but the truth is we don't really know. We don't know because he won't release his tax returns. You're right. We know that when he rips the toilets out of his house to get a multi-$100,000 tax break, the rest of us in Cook County all pay more. That's true, just like when you use politically connected property tax attorneys to decrease the Wolf Point and Merchandise Mart property tax bill, the rest of us pay more. But when it comes to these offshore tax avoidance strategies, we have no idea, which is why throughout all of 2016, all Democrats were saying, dude, Donald Trump should release his tax returns. And now here we are in 2018, and 2 of the 3 leading candidates for governor on the Democratic side won't do it. It's just not okay.
Chris Kennedy, in terms of tax returns, you just relieved the cover pages on 1 year of taxes. Why didn't you release more?
More than that. I identified every trust that I benefit from. I identified every holding that I own. Any conflict that I might have is listed in that disclosure form. I went beyond what the law required, and while Mr. Biss tries to make an issue of that, the fact is I've gone further than others, and I've shown every entity that might pose a conflict of interest. And I think that's a good model for what people should do in the state. What we don't know is what Mr. Pritzker is hiding, and that's a big issue for all of us.
How about that, J.B. Pritzker? A lack of transparency? An expert quoted in the Tribune article this morning said there are 2 reasons to set up trusts or companies overseas. Number 1 is to avoid tax. Number 2 is to make things complicated in terms of figuring out who's doing what.
Well, I remind you that these trusts were set up generations ago. They were not set up by me, and that they're dedicated entirely to charity.
Again, trusts and companies recently connected to you or your family members.
But I did not set up those companies. I did not set up those trusts. They're trying to reach back, years and years, decades and decades, and it's just not correct. It's not accurate.
Let's move on. There was a nationwide student walkout today, Daniel Biss. You've expressed support for gun control legislation, but how will you convince gun owners, particularly gun owners downstate, that you are not going to gut their, quote, Second Amendment rights?
I was proud to participate in the walkout today out of the Senate chamber to the outside of the state capitol, and we had a good day in the legislature today passing 3 common sense gun safety bills out of the Senate. And I think that shows the answer to your question, Phil. We are seeing a change in this country. The NRA, which is primarily listening not to gun owners, but to gun manufacturers who fund them, is starting to lose its grip because of organizers on the other side. And we're starting to build a coalition of people who have traditionally supported gun safety legislation together with many gun owners to move forward.
And yet a lot of gun owners, downstate, maybe more so than in other places, just by virtue of the difference in demographics and societal interests and so forth, would say, you know what, the attempt to tighten the standards on gun dealers and so forth, waiting periods and so forth, it all is a slippery slope to diminishing my Second Amendment rights. What do you say to that person?
What I say to that person is, let's look at the bills we're passing. Let's look at the ideas we're debating, and let's have an honest conversation. And there will be some disagreements, by the way. Not everyone agrees about everything. But the scaremongering tactics of the NRA that have persuaded gun owners, who in fact are often supportive of common sense gun safety legislation, to somehow oppose candidates who support those good bills, are starting to weaken. I'm going to keep on fighting to weaken the NRA. I've got a lifetime F rating from them, which is one of the few Fs that I'm proud of in my life. And the good news is that more and more people across the state are also pleased with that F rating.
Gentlemen, at this point, I'd like for you to raise your hand if you agree with the following statement. In other words, raising your hands means yes. Raise your hand. Would you sell the Thompson Center? 1 out of 3. Would you support raising the gas tax to pay for infrastructure? None out of 3. Would you support a Chicago casino? Raise your hands if yes. 1. Would you support the bill to eliminate daylight savings time in Illinois?
Do I get to sleep later, or do I have to get up early?
If you'd asked me the day before yesterday, it's a different story.
Okay, I see not a lot of support for that one. Raise your hand. Would you close Chicago State University?
No.
My God.
Oh, I see someone sitting on their hands. Yeah. Let's go to a viewer question. This one is from Marjorie Benson, and she asks, currently, Illinois does not tax Social Security and retirement income. Should it, Chris Kennedy?
Absolutely not. The average retiree in the state of Illinois makes about $18,000 a year. We should go after people who make $18,000 a year to balance our budget. We should close the loophole that allows internet sellers to sell into our communities without paying their fair share of sales taxes. We should go after people who claim to live in another state but continue to work in Illinois, make money here, and don't pay their fair share of income tax. The state of New York does that, and they collect billions of dollars. The state of Colorado is going after the internet sellers, and they'll collect billions of dollars. Let's go after those people who don't even live in this state, or mooching off of us, or cheating on the taxes, and then we can balance our budget without going after people who make $18,000 a year. Now, I'm going to tell this to you, JB. You've been running ads saying that I'm in favor of taxing retirement income. It's not true. I posted it on my website. I've gone to forum after forum, Q&A after Q&A. Look at me in the eyes. I want to let you know I'm not for that. Please stop running those lies.
Well, you've got a different position today than you've had during this campaign.
Nope.
Because you, several times have said you are open to retirement taxation. And so that's just a fact. If you've changed your position, that's fine. That's good, because I am opposed to retirement taxation.
So you'll take those ads down. Is that what you're saying? Now that you have clarity from me,
have you changed your position?
Face-to-face clarity right now.
I'm telling you,
I've told you what my position is.
As a result of the ad going up.
That is not what you want in a governor.
The same thing
a guy
for
like
Senator
that
Biss.
who can lie to get a job is going to lie to keep it.
Dan,
so don't
in
want
fact, said he was open to retirement taxation as well. I'm not.
Let these two guys yell at each other about each other's taxes all we want. That's fun. Here's the bottom line. I'm against taxing the retirement income of middle-class people like myself. But J.B. Pritzker should pay a retirement income tax. And because he's scared of having to do that, he's lying about my position.
Daniel, may I say, that's not what retirement income tax is. We need a progressive income tax in this state so that wealthy people pay more and we protect the middle class and those striving to get there, lower their overall tax bill. But retirement income tax is about pensions and 401ks and Social Security. I don't think we should be taxing those.
You know, one of the questions raised today, I don't mean to circle around to the Tribune article today, but the assertion is that with all your overseas holdings, trust companies, however you call them, and if they are being sheltered for tax purposes, is it hypocritical to call for a graduated income tax, a progressive income tax, whereby other people who have some means would be subject to higher taxes when you in fact might be sheltering some of your taxes?
Well, that's not accurate. The fact is that paying taxes here federal, state taxes, the highest state rate you can pay in the state of Illinois for all the assets that are held in trust for my benefit that I have any involvement with that are taxable.
Including the companies, because I'm still hazy about that.
Yes, including the companies, but remember
those
that
companies overseas are currently paying state and federal taxes?
You're talking about the overseas trust, when the reality is those are dedicated to charity. Any distributions that come from those go to charitable organizations. What we're talking about here are companies in the United States, companies when they make an income, they pay an income tax, and here in Illinois, those trusts pay at the highest rate, as do they pay federal income taxes.
So
Dan Biss, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I do. This is just exposing the fraud that is the J.B. Pritzker campaign for governor. You've been running since you realized that it was popular when I said it on a progressive income tax. And now we've learned that you've been avoiding taxes in any way possible. And I think the question that we ought to be asking ourselves is not, do we need a progressive income tax? Every candidate now in March of 2018 says that. The question is, who's going to do it? The two guys who've been benefiting from our broken system for decades, or the person who's been fighting for progressive taxation in the legislature?
Daniel Biss, some people say that your voting record undermines your assertion that you're representing the middle class. You voted for tax breaks for corporations, a measure to reduce pension benefits for state employees. You voted to cut Medicaid health spending for the poor. What do you say?
I'll say I'm proud of my record in the legislature. And on things like pensions, I've talked openly about how I got into the legislature and tried to tackle a difficult problem and didn't get it right in 2013. By the way, after J.B. Pritzker was attacking me for not voting for pension changes back in 2011, I've talked about how I fell for a false choice and learned from that, and how that's informed my continued efforts to solve that problem in the right way, which I think is what a leader does. But I've been fighting in the legislature for 7 years to lift up the lives of ordinary people in Illinois, fighting to expand health care successfully, fighting to pass the toughest student loan bill of rights in the country here in Illinois, fighting for a retirement savings bill that's changing retirement security across the country, giving millions of people in Illinois a shot at a dignified retirement. I'm the only person on this stage, number one, who's grappled with those difficult choices that face someone in politics, and number two, with a record of passing progressive laws.
Oh, please, come on. He spent 7 years down there. 7 years down there. He fell for Springfield. That's what he just said. I fell for Springfield, and now he wants us to send him back as the governor of the state. He couldn't stand up for what was right. The Democrats had a supermajority in the state Senate, a supermajority in the state House, controlled the governor's mansion at the same time while he was there, and did nothing to fix the funding for our schools, did nothing to bring about a progressive income tax in our state. He's part of a failed system, and it's time we bring change to the future of Illinois to fund our schools properly.
And yet both you and J.B. Pritzker, neither one of you has held elected public office. Is it presumptuous of you, in large part, one could say, because of your financial assets, are going for the top office in the state without having spent time in the saddle?
I'd put up my track record against anybody. I ran the Merchandise Mart, one of the great economic engines of the world. I ran 90 trade shows a year in 30 different vertical markets with 10,000 exhibiting companies. I was elected chairman of the Convention Bureau. I was elected chairman by my colleagues of the Chicago Convention and Tourism Bureau. I was 27, 28 years old, and it emerged as the largest food bank in the United States.
But is that
I was chairman of the
take?
University of Illinois with a $5.5 billion a year budget, the closest thing to running a large government. And I think that puts me in great qualifications for the state's top job.
J.B. Pritzker, never held elected public office before. Presumptuous of you to go for the big brass ring.
Well, first of all, I've done big things all across the state of Illinois for working families. And it's not J.B. Pritzker writing a check. It's J.B. Pritzker getting policies passed in Springfield and Washington, D.C. on behalf of our most at-risk kids to make sure they get quality preschool and quality childcare. 230 kids in low-income school districts getting school breakfast, kids who otherwise wouldn't get school breakfast. Creating thousands and thousands of jobs through the creation of 1871, the Small Business Incubator here in Chicago. And I think it's hypocritical of Chris Kennedy, who was the chairman of the University of Illinois, when he raised tuition five times, and caused in-state students to leave the state after a 30% rise almost in tuition, and African-American enrollment going down 17%. So that's the kind of public service that he's done. I ran the Human Rights Commission.
If you're saying that the board of the University of Illinois, while I was chairman of the board, which was majority minority, you're telling me Francis Carroll sitting back there teamed up with Jim Montgomery and Rick Estrada and Carlos Tortolero and Judge Patricia Holmes and got together to try to find a way to push minorities out of the University of Illinois.
Did you vote
That's
for
the most absurd thing I've
times?
ever heard.
Did
During
you?
that period, we put $100 million aside for scholarship money, and we're proud that today half the kids that attend the U of I benefit from those scholarships. The reason minority enrollment declined at the University of Illinois, JB, was something called the Great Recession. And I understand with your $3 billion, you may not have been aware that during that time period, this country went through an economic collapse where millions of people lost their homes, millions of people lost their jobs, millions of people lost their ability to send their kids to college, and that's what drove attendance at the University
During that
of
same
Illinois.
time
That's
period,
what
Dan Biss
so listen,
voted
while
with
these-
Republicans to garnish people's wages who are struggling to pay their student loans. Why did you engage in that activity during the Great Recession?
Dan Biss.
Well, thank you for asking, Phil. There is not someone
Actually, he
in
asked.
Springfield. Well, you at least named me, which is pleasant. There's no one in Springfield who's done more for student loan borrowers. I passed the toughest student loan bill of rights of any state in the country, and yes, I voted for legislation that gave the state Student Assistance Commission the same power that federal student loan lenders have, so they would stop being forced to sue students and harm their credit rating. But listen, while these two guys fight about which one was richer and which one was benefiting more while they weren't doing anything in state government, let's talk about what's happening here. We have Bruce Rauner, he's failed. We have Donald Trump, he's failed. We've tried this, I'm a successful businessman, trust me, watch the stuff I did unrelated to government. It hasn't worked. And so now they're going to pick apart my record bill by bill when I'm the one who's passed almost 90 laws, progressive priorities, lifting people up, creating retirement security, expanding access to health care. They haven't done it.
The government
they
of the
don't
state
know
of
how to
Illinois
do
to
it.
brutally go after the retirement incomes from people in this state. There's nothing worse that a Democrat can do than what you did. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to sit here and listen to you go on about your great record when you went after the most vulnerable people in the state and you were proud of it, and then turned around and said that, oh, I fell for Springfield. I'm sorry, Daniel, that's disqualified.
Quick response, Daniel Biss.
Well, JB recently put out a video of Chris talking about how he supported that effort, and JB was funding a much more extreme group years before. So
JB
the truth,
Pritzker,
the truth of the matter is that pensions are a promise. And I have been in the legislature trying to find ways to fund our pensions, and I'm the candidate on this stage who is actually fighting for the revenue solutions that will enable us to fund pensions.
JB Pritzker, you have put $63 million of your own money into this campaign effort. If you lose, how much money will you pledge to spend to defeat Governor Rauner?
You know, I've supported Democrats my whole life. I've been a Democrat my whole life. My parents were Democrats. And I'm very proud to say that whoever it is that wins, and I think it'll be me, but whoever it is that wins, I'll support in this election campaign. It's so important that we defeat Bruce Rauner. He has been a miserable failure for working families. We've no health care, no job creation, no education funding. Bruce Rauner's got to go.
Speaking of Governor Rauner, has he
He didn't
done?
answer the question, did he?
How much? Well, you said you'd continue to support the Democratic.
This is coming from Daniel, who has accepted $350,000 from people who do business with the state just in the last few weeks, people who gave money to Bruce Rauner, hundreds of thousands of dollars from Springfield insiders, including Mike Madigan, in order to get elected in the first place, voted for Mike Madigan for Speaker. This is Daniel, who is putting forward a record saying that he wants to be a middle-class governor, but you haven't stood up for the middle-class pensions. You've taken money away from neighborhood public schools to give it to charter schools. I mean, you're not who you say you are.
So listen, I'm not going to sit here and be lectured on who's a progressive by the guy who's storing money offshore to avoid taxes and profiting off the Dakota Access Pipeline. I'm not going to sit here.
Let me lecture you.
Well, we can talk later. We can talk later. But it is just genuinely amazing to me when J.B. Pritzker tries to lecture me about my campaign funding. Are you kidding me? J.B. Pritzker has given $63 million to his campaign fund in an effort to buy this election, in an effort to make Mike Madigan happy because Mike Madigan wants his money that badly. And he can't pull away in the polls because the people of Illinois understand that we shouldn't emulate Trump and Rauner. We shouldn't have an auction. We should have an election. And I'm incredibly proud of the fact that I'm here at all. I mean, let's be honest, Phil. When I announced my campaign almost a year ago, people didn't think I'd be on the stage with these two guys. But we are. Because tens of thousands of people
let's move it on. Gentlemen, let's move it along.
Tens of thousands of people have stepped up to make us have a chance in a race because the people of Illinois are hungry for a middle-class progressive. Let's give them what they deserve.
Let's move it along. Chris Kennedy, the new school funding program formula requires an additional $350 million a year from the state. Where would you get that money?
It's about 5% of what we're doing, and it's not nearly enough. If we want to fully fund our schools, and there's nothing more important. When I graduated from high school, this is back in the 80s, in the last century, my friends and I, we moved to where the jobs were. That's not the way the American economy works anymore. Now the jobs move to where the highly educated young people are. If we give the world highly educated young people, the world will give us its jobs. Money, investments, capital follows talent. Unfortunately, in Illinois, about 75% of the kids who graduate high school need remedial education before going to community college or university. So we're failing in job number one. How do we fund those schools? I think we have to go after the internet sellers who are, I think, stealing from us in the state of Illinois. I think there's billions of dollars there. I think we have to go after people who claim to live in other states and take income here and don't pay their fair share. I think we have to go after the property tax system in our state and abandon it. And the role of the state government should be to file undervaluation complaints against the largest buildings and the most egregious examples of where people like Joe Barrios have sided with the people who've given him campaign donations and against the people of our state. If we do those things, we're not going to put our economy at risk. We're not going to overburden our taxpayers. We're actually going after people who live elsewhere.
Let's go to a viewer question, and this one has to do with the budget. Fixing the budget. In Illinois will take courage and involve both necessary cuts to important programs and additional revenue. What unpopular but necessary specific steps are you willing to take on both the cut and the revenue side that your other Democratic opponents are not? J.B. Pritzker.
Well, as I've said earlier, I'm in favor of a progressive income tax. I'm also in favor of us legalizing marijuana and taxing it. And I believe that'll bring in $350 million to $700 million of revenue to the state. And in addition to that, let's talk about the budget, because there are really three aspects of a budget. Many people just talk about two: expenditures and revenues. A third aspect of it is growth. We've got to have job growth in the state in order to increase revenues without having to raise taxes. But under Bruce Rauner,
Republicans say, how about in terms of cuts? What cuts would you make?
Well, let's remind ourselves that the Republican governor that we've got today is the biggest deficit spender in the history of the state of Illinois. And the result of that was that last year we paid almost $1 billion in that 12% backlog interest rate that he caused, and fees. That's $1 billion. Imagine what you could do with $1 billion in the education system, and we ought to bring that in. Imagine what you could do in our healthcare system, and we ought to bring that in. I happen to think we need universal healthcare. Now, but all of these things take real shoulder to the wheel. You need revenue, expenditures, and growth to make a budget work in the state of Illinois.
No cuts?
Well, here's how I would do it. I've spent more than 20 years in the early childhood development arena. I have focused on trying to raise up, particularly our at-risk kids, the 25% of kids in the United States and in the state of Illinois that are not ready for kindergarten. When we help them prepare, when we make sure we've got universal preschool, which I favor, and quality childcare, it will save money in our education system significantly. Same thing, by the way, with prevention in the healthcare system. You go after type 2 diabetes, you can save hundreds of millions of dollars.
Daniel Biss, unpopular but necessary steps regarding revenue or cuts?
Well, I think we need a tax system designed for a modern economy. That's why, unlike these two guys, I support taxing financial transactions and closing the so-called carried interest or Bruce Rauner tax loophole. That's something I actually passed a bill out of the Senate to do. Why do I say that? Because our economy has transformed in the last several decades. More and more of our economy is in the financial sector, but these two guys don't want to tax that part of the economy, which means they're going to either not have a budget that works, or else they're going to have a tax system that overburdens working families.
Chris Kennedy, you were shaking your head no. How come?
Because it's just the worst form of political pandering. to say that no one has to make any sacrifice. We're going to fully fund every program of government. Nobody has to worry about a thing because we're going to tax financial transactions. I mean, it gives everybody false hope. It's the worst thing a Democrat can do. We ought to tell the truth. We ought to bring people into the complexities, the subtleties, the nuances of government policy and not offer them a solution that can't be had. Daniel, just let me explain what he's suggesting. He's suggesting that we go to the exchanges where transactions are occurring between people, let's say, buying corn or soybeans, and tax every one of those transactions. Those transactions occur between a buyer and a seller. There's a matching engine, a computer that matches when you say I bought 10,000 bushels at $1.86 and I say I sold 10,000 bushels at $1.86. That matching engine is in Chicago, but there are duplicates all around the United States. If he tries to tax that on LaSalle Street or Wacker Drive, where it's more properly located, those exchanges will simply use the one that they have located in Atlanta or Wyoming and say the transaction occurred there, which is technically true, and we will not be able to derive any new economic revenue for the state of Illinois. He's promising something he can't deliver, which is political pandering. And worse than that, 3-4 years ago, he passed a bill which he supported, aimed at a single company, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, to lower their taxes. He gave them the tax break he now says he wants, as a progressive, to take away. And as Mr. Pritzker has said, you don't know who Daniel is. Not today, not then.
How about that, Daniel Biss? Because
a long diatribe there, and I do find it sort of amazing.
But wouldn't those businesses simply leave if a financial transaction tax was imposed?
Yes.
And also, wouldn't federal law be required to be changed in order for what you say, for what you're proposing to take place?
No, I don't believe it would. But let me just point out that Chris has now twice, on two totally different topics, accused me of doing the worst possible thing a Democrat can do. So at least one of those must have been at worst the second worst thing a Democrat could do. But anyhow, listen, I take that concern seriously. I take the concern of the exchanges moving seriously. I take the impacts of our tax decisions seriously, which is why we got to sit down and figure out how to do it as other countries have, as New York City did in the past. It is not an impossible thing. But what these two guys are telling you, two guys who are experts in helping the wealthy avoid taxes, that it's impossible, we shouldn't even try. What they're telling you in March of 2018, 10 months before either one would even become governor, is that they're taking revenue options entirely off the table. And then they're calling me irresponsible when they're the ones taking revenue options off the table. Come on, let's figure out how to solve it, given that that's where our economy has gone. Let's not consign ourselves to a tax system built for an economy we just don't have anymore.
Gentlemen, let's go to another round of raise your hands if you agree questions. Number one, and this was alluded to just a little bit ago by Mr. Kennedy, should Joe Barrios be reelected as Cook County Assessor? Raise your hands if you believe yes.
I'm not revealing who I voted for or who I'm supporting in that race, because I don't think we should be getting involved in Democratic primaries. We're running one ourselves.
Oh my gosh. If you can't take a position on whether Joe Barrios should be reelected, a guy who's maintaining a system that's a de facto violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, if you can't show
Chris, you got millions of dollars of tax breaks from the tax assessor of Cook County
to take a position on that race, you shouldn't be the governor of the state of Illinois.
The truth of
you
the matter
have no
is
way
that
to
lead
the Democratic Party or the state of Illinois.
Hey, let's turn it around.
Let's move on. Please raise your hand.
Your head hurts. Guys.
Oh, please.
We can let these two guys keep on fighting until 8 o'clock about who's scammed the property tax system worse. Or we can pick someone who hasn't scammed the property tax system, who's got legislation to fix it.
7 years in Springfield and never figured out that the property tax system was a scam.
That's
spent 7 years not trying to change it.
Okay, let's go back to hand raising, please. Would
Please.
you sign a bill creating an elected school board in Chicago? Raise your hand if you agree. All three of you, all right? Should Mike Madigan step down as head of the state Democratic Party? Raise your hand if you think he should.
I think he should step back during the period during which their investigations into sexual harassment are going on. That's what I think.
I believe that there needs to be a complete independent investigation of him, his office, the Democratic Party of Illinois, so we can determine who the perpetrators are in these sexual harassment allegations. It took too long for him to identify the problem, to go after it, and now we need that independent investigation. We ought to hold him responsible if, in fact, he's either a perpetrator or allowed this to go on.
Related question. Raise your your hand if you think Mike Madigan should lose his position as House Speaker. Raise your hand if you think yes.
I think that's been called into real question. I think that the Democratic members of the House need to give that a tough look. But I will tell you, as a member of the Democratic Party, he's lost my confidence in his ability to lead our party.
I mean, there ought to be term limits, and he ought to be termed out at this point.
But he helped Dan Biss get elected.
There ought to be term limits on that role, and he should be termed out. That's what I believe.
But remember, Dan Biss voted for Mike Madigan for Speaker, accepted his money in order to get elected, and has been ran the super PAC that Mike Madigan set up in 2016. It seems to me, once again, you don't know who Dan Biss really is.
So this is a really,
Dan Biss, hold on.
This is a really important attack that I cannot let go unaddressed because it is bananas.
It's just not another speech, please. Please.
How long do I have, Chris?
I don't know, but you've taken so much.
Dan Biss, there are reports that you're actually working to oust Mike Madigan as state party chair. If that fails and you're elected governor, are you concerned that he'll block your agenda, that the working relationship would be non-existent?
I'll get to that in a second, but I want to address JB's point. I'm a Democrat, and that means that I work with Democrats in general elections. I worked with Democrats against Donald Trump and against Bruce Rauner, and in my own general elections, like I'm going to work with every single Democrat when I'm the nominee in 2018 to defeat Bruce Rauner. Of course I do. JB doesn't get that because he wasn't sure in 2012 if he was going to vote for Barack Obama for re-election. He didn't even know if he was going to vote for Barack Obama for re-election until he saw who won the Republican nomination. The question isn't, are you a Democrat who works with Democrats in general elections? The question is, what wing of the party are you from? There's the Madigan-Pritzker wing of the party, and there's the independent progressive wing of the party, and I have always been a firm member of the independent progressive wing of the party, which is why I'm supported by progressive groups in this primary.
The only person on the stage who voted for Mike Madigan is saying that.
What is your relationship with Mike Madigan, J.B. Pritzker? How would you describe it?
You know what? He's the chairman of the Democratic Party. That's the relationship. I'm a candidate for governor. And as Dan Biss has said, in a general election, as Democrats, we'll all end up running together.
Chris Kennedy, you had a confused expression on your face.
The complexity of all of this is that you have the Speaker, Mike Madigan, who basically is veto authority on any legislation going through both houses because it has to pass both. He takes that role and he becomes chairman of the party. Those roles were always separate while I've been in Illinois. Now they're combined in a single individual. From that place, he helps choose the head of the Democratic Party of Cook County, Joe Berrios. Joe Berrios, as head of the Cook County Democratic Party, slates himself as the Cook County assessor and becomes the assessor. Now Mike Madigan appeals taxes for property owners to Joe Berrios, who he put in that job. And that office that he has for the Democratic Party is the very office that J.B. Pritzker used to make telephone calls at Joe Berrios' desk, at Joe Berrios' chair, using Joe Berrios' phone.
Okay, quick response, J.B. Pritzker, and then we have to move on.
Yeah, that's just not true. I mean, first of all, we have serious flaws in the tax system, in the property tax assessment system in Cook County. That's true, and we need to make sure that we make it more transparent for people, that we have the most up-to-date formulas so that people don't have to go appeal their taxes every single year. That's what we need to go after, and we need to make sure there are no conflicts of interest by people who serve in the legislature. That's something we have to go after, too.
And the question is, what kind of party do we want to have, right? Chris began this campaign by going to try to be the candidate of the Madigan wing of the party. They said no because they wanted Pritzker. So then he came to progressives and wanted to be our candidate. We said no because I'm the progressive candidate. And now he's trying to create a Rauner wing of the Democratic Party.
And yet you presented your own credentials to the Cook County Democratic Party.
The truth is that J.B. Pritzker is Mike Madigan's candidate. And if elected, he would be Mike Madigan's first hand-picked governor.
At least we know who he is.
Gentlemen, given how much money that is going into this race on the part of all of you, should these elections be publicly funded? Chris Kennedy?
I believe they should. I believe that would give us a much more fair and inclusive system in the government. I don't think money is necessarily the root of all evil in politics. It can lift up issues. It can educate the voters. It can bring to the attention of people in our state complicated and nuanced issues that everybody should be aware of in a multicultural democracy. But when you use money not to lift up issues, to shine light on them, but to blot out any other campaign, when you use money to control the airwaves and to take away the notion of a conflict of ideas and ideals, well, then I think money has a corrosive role in politics, and I think that's what we're seeing from the Pritzker campaign.
A corrosive influence in politics, J.B. Pritzker?
Well, I think there should be matching contributions. That was your question. But let's face it, let's look back to December of 2016 when Bruce Rauner wrote a check for $50 million into his own campaign account and then accepted tens of millions of dollars from the Koch brothers right-wing network. And you know what their agenda is. Destroy labor unions, lower wages in the state, lower workplace safety in the state. I think that's wrong. Now, just like Senator Paul Simon once said about campaign finance reform, we need campaign finance reform, but we can't unilaterally disarm in the process of it. When I'm elected, we're actually going to get campaign finance reform. We need to make sure we have a matching system for small contributions in campaigns.
Let's go to a viewer question.
Let's go to that one?
You know what? We need to move it on. We want to get some viewer involvement.
I just want to point out that small donor matching bill, campaign finance reform, that's my bill. That's what I've been fighting for, and that's what we need so we don't have this auction instead of an election.
And our viewer question comes from Dave Barkmeyer, and he asks, what are your plans for increasing renewable energy production for residential and commercial users? Dan Biss, I'll begin with you.
Well, I'm proud to be endorsed by the Sierra Club in this election. I've been fighting for expansion of renewable energy, expansion of solar, expansion of wind. Illinois should be a national and global leader on this issue, and we have the opportunity to do it. I'm going to fight to make that happen. By contrast, these two guys have investments in dirty energy. The Dakota Access Pipeline in JB's case, and oil companies in Chris's case. If we want someone as governor who's going to expand renewable energy, we need someone who's been fighting for it. Not someone who's been profiting from dirty energy.
Chris Kennedy, you have investments in dirty energy?
No, he says that. I had them at one moment and one time. I divested myself of all of the interests in those publicly traded companies that were disclosed on my financial disclosure forms. The great way to bring about renewable energy in the state of Illinois is to do what we did at the Merchandise Mart. The Mart became the world's largest LEED certified building. The building next door, the Chicago Apparel Mart, became the second largest building in Illinois to be LEED certified. The hotel above it, the first hotel in Illinois and the largest hotel in the United States to be LEED certified. There are things that the government can do to drive down greenhouse gases. Almost all energy is used in the built environment. The government is almost always the largest user, owner-occupier of the built environment in their jurisdiction. The state of Illinois doesn't even have an accurate inventory of the buildings it owns or occupies. Whatever they are, we should put the state government on a track to be fully sustainable by 2025 and the entire state on fully sustainable energy sources by 2045. I think we can do that.
J.B. Pritzker, how about it? Renewable energy for commercial and residential structures?
We need to move to 100% clean energy use in the state of Illinois. And the way to do that is to begin, as I did, to help support the creation of businesses in the state of Illinois. The Clean Energy Trust, something that I supported from its very beginning, helping people start companies that are focused on clean energy development. Remember, here in the state, we have a very important, at Argonne National Laboratory, a very important research facility focused on battery technology. That's critical if we want to make sure that we're getting 100% clean energy in the state, and it's also creating jobs in the state. And we've got to do that. As you move away from fossil fuels, people are being displaced from their jobs. We missed out. Iowa took the opportunity to put windmills in and has done very well doing that. We need to get there. We need to make sure that the people who've lost their jobs over years in the coal industry, for example, are beneficiaries of our move to 100% clean energy.
Here's another related question from a viewer. What are your plans to protect Lake Michigan and various rivers from pollution and changing weather patterns, flooding, etc.? Are the current standards regarding water quality adequate? Chris Kennedy, I'll begin with you.
I think there's a lot that we can do to protect the greatest resource, natural resource that we have in the state of Illinois, which I believe is Lake Michigan. We can protect Lake Michigan, we can protect our network of rivers and streams and our wild areas as well. All of those are under attack by decisions in the Trump administration to defund the thousands of independent not-for-profit organizations that surround all of the Great Lakes. I think if you look at what they're doing in Indiana, where they've created a bilateral relationship with Canada to protect the Great Lakes, that's the leadership that a governor should show. And Governor Rauner has been silent around protecting the Great Lakes. As the Asian carp makes its way up the Illinois River, he's done nothing to prevent that and show leadership on an issue that is super apparent to everybody who's paying attention.
Daniel Biss, protecting Lake Michigan?
Oh, it's so crucial. And again, I'm proud of the Sierra Club endorsement because of the confidence they have that I'm the right governor to do just that. It's true that Governor Rauner has canceled infrastructure projects that would have helped stop the flow of Asian carp toward Lake Michigan. We have to make sure those projects happen. We also have to make sure that we move state investments away from dirty energy industry so that pipelines aren't built in the state of Illinois to continue to pollute our waterways. We have to regulate agriculture properly so that we have sustainable agriculture that does not pollute our waterways. And finally, we need to invest in infrastructure, in water infrastructure, because right now there are far too many places in Illinois where we are poisoning our own children.
J.B. Pritzker, how about it? Protecting the
Great
lakes
Lakes are a vital natural resource. I mean, fresh water, we've got to make sure we preserve it. There are two very important things that we can do. One is we've got to have an EPA in Illinois that's actually protecting our waterways. We don't have that under Bruce Rauner. And the second thing is, remember that the governor of the state of Illinois, although they're in charge of the state, the governor of the state of Illinois has a great deal of power in the federal government with our federal legislators. But you know, under Bruce Rauner, over the last 3 years, Senator Durbin, who's endorsed my campaign, has said publicly that over the last 3 years, he's received calls from Bruce Rauner only 3 times in 3 years. We need a governor who's actually going to stand up and protect our state. That Great Lakes Basin Initiative that Donald Trump tried to defund, we needed a governor who would actually stand up and do something about it, but instead he's an utter and complete failure.
The three of you have taken a lot of shots at Governor Rauner tonight. Has the governor done anything right? Has the governor done anything well from your perspectives? Dan Biss.
Well, I think that he has set some good goals and gone about achieving them the exact wrong way. For example, he set a good goal on criminal justice reform, decreasing our prison population by 25%. Then he had a task force come up with really good, strong recommendations, and he helped implement the politically easy ones and walked away from the politically difficult ones.
J.B. Pritzker, has the governor done anything well in your book?
Well, he signed HB 40, which is the abortion rights bill that I supported significantly. He had to be pressured into it, however. It took all. I have the endorsement of Personal PAC, the state's pro-choice PAC, and we worked together in the pro-choice community. I've been doing this for decades now. We worked together to pressure the governor to finally sign that legislation reluctantly. But I have to say, that was the right thing to do.
Chris Kennedy.
And I'd have to say the protection of people's right to choose in the state of Illinois stands out as maybe the singular thing that Governor Rauner has done that is admirable. But there's so much that he's done that he is today, I think, the worst sitting governor in all of the United States and the worst governor ever to govern Illinois, including those governors who have gone to jail. He's worse than all of them.
Gentlemen, we're almost out of time, and I'd like to ask a personal question of each of you, and that is, give me an example of a formative experience in your life. J.B. Pritzker, beginning with you.
Well, gosh, as a young person, unfortunately, my mother was an alcoholic and passed away when I was 17. My father had passed away when I was 7, and the experience of living through that with my brother and sister, fighting through that, dealing with the challenges, and also recognizing what a hero my mother really was, fighting that struggle. That's extraordinarily formative to me because, honestly, one of the very reasons that I'm engaged in public service is because my mother, too, was engaged in public service, and I watched her struggle with addiction. And I don't want others to have to go through that, and I want to live up to her values, the things that she set for us about fighting for social and economic justice, equality, and inclusion.
Chris Kennedy.
I mean, I'd say my story is similar to Mr. Pritzker's, and I think that's unfortunate, and that a society like ours produces these outcomes. And I think about my father's death at an early age, and I know that the bullet that kills the father wounds the child. And I understand what that was like to grow up in a chaotic environment when I was trying to process that. But more dramatically, I guess, I saw siblings struggle with it as well. And I lost one brother to drug addiction, another was addicted to heroin for a decade, and I saw the ravishing effects of untreated mental illness. And I think somewhere in all of that, there's empathy that comes from people who are not going to be able to make it on their own. And we have a role as a big family and as a government to reach out to folks who are suffering.
Daniel Biss.
You know, I'm incredibly just happy that my wife Karen is here, and I think back to the day, April 1st, 2005, that we met in the Austin, Texas airport, and it changed my life completely. And Karen has taught me so much about a few things, but the most important thing she's taught me about is that when you see something wrong in the world, it doesn't matter if it looks big, it doesn't matter if it looks intimidating, it doesn't matter if it looks like it's just too much. You have to do what you can to try to make it better. And every day in my life, I carry that lesson with me, and I just feel so lucky for what happened on April 1st, 2005.
Gentlemen, thank you. J.B. Pritzker, Chris Kennedy, Daniel Biss, and our thanks again to the City Club of Chicago for helping underwrite tonight's forum. Thanks also to our audience here tonight on WTTW, WTTW.com, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and to the candidates, J.B. Pritzker, Chris Kennedy, and Daniel Biss. And we will be back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the City Club of Chicago.
Smart people may disagree about what makes a great city, but part of what makes Chicago great is that we don't have to agree. To run a city like ours, a lot of issues come up. The City Club of Chicago is a place to debate those issues and hear from the men and women who shape the policies, lead the industries, and tell the stories that define our city. For the free and open exchange of ideas, the City Club of Chicago.
And that is our show for this Wednesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily e-alert, and please join us tomorrow night live at 7. We hear from 3 Democrats vying to replace Luis Gutierrez in Congress, and why Illinois House Speaker Mike Madigan is at war with some progressive members of his own party. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Phil Ponce, and I thank you for watching. Good night.
Closed captioning for this program is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, proud sponsors of the Chicago Bar Foundation's Investing in Justice campaign that supports pro bono and legal aid organizations for the needy throughout the Chicago area.